All right, good afternoon, Communication Theories class. Hope all of you are doing well. As I mentioned in the email that I sent to you earlier today, our next exam will be on Wednesday, over chapters 14 and 16, which will be the social judgment theory and the cognitive dissonance theory. And I wanted to review and send you this video today, as well as send you an email with the study guide for this so that you'll be prepared for what that test will entail. So the first part here, chapter 14, the social judgment theory. Basically what the social judgment theory is, it's a perception and evaluation of an idea by comparing it with current attitudes. This theory describes mental processes taking place that are often automatic or automatic processing, things that we don't think a whole lot about. So the social judgment theory kind of talks about how we perceive things just from a general perspective. So it could be things in the media, could be just decisions that we make and the perception process that we go through in figuring out how we feel about something, the perception that we have about it, what judgment we feel is appropriate for that particular question or something going on in our life. So that's basically what the social judgment theory is, how we arrive at that process of what decision we make on a particular thing that we're trying to analyze and perceive. So there's three ways that we do this. And this is something you'll need to know for the test, the three latitudes described in the social judgment theory. So these should be pretty self-explanatory here. After going through them, there's a little bit more in detail you can get with them. But basically, we have three latitudes that the social judgment theory describes. And the first one is latitude of acceptance. These are basically the range of ideas that a person sees as reasonable or worthy of consideration, or something that you might agree with, or things that you generally accept without having to think too much about it. Latitude of rejection are things that are opposite of that. We know if we don't accept them, we reject them. And so it's the range of ideas that a person sees as unreasonable or objectionable, or they object to it. They don't see any relevance to it at all. And then you have the third one, which is kind of neither acceptance or rejection. You're just non-committal to it. So the latitude of non-commitment, range of ideas that a person sees as neither acceptable or objectionable. So they might not have any opinion one way or the other on it. So they would be described as just non-committal. So anything that you think about in your life that you automatically accept, that would fall into that latitude of acceptance. If you automatically reject something for whatever reason, based on your background, context, past experience, if you reject something, that would be in your latitude of rejection. And then if there's something that you just have no opinion on whatsoever, or you just maybe haven't experienced anything within that context before, you would probably just be non-committal. You wouldn't have an opinion one way or the other on it. So that would fall into the latitude of non-commitment. So this was the kind of chart that we looked at, or diagram or figure that we looked at in class. And the example here is talking about safety, air safety. And so you have this latitude of acceptance, latitude of rejection, and in the middle here, you have this latitude of non-commitment. And you see this right here, this anchor point. So this anchor point is where this particular person described in this example feels. Okay, so they're leaning more towards the latitude of rejection, that it's not safe to fly. Whereas if they were kind of the anchor point was more to the right, they might be more likely to think that safety in the air, or it is very safe to fly, because you see on the right side here, they talk about how air marshals protect them. Screening is federalized, so there's not as much of this hijacking that could take place. And then as you get to the far left, you have all these scary things that they're talking about is why they reject the notion that flying is safe. Okay, so they're looking at it more from a negative perspective based on maybe their experience with flying. Okay, so we have this anchor point. So if you see anchor point, that's just how that particular person feels, or the stance that they're taking. So if you accept it, your anchor point will fall more towards the latitude of acceptance. If you reject it, you're going to fall more, on this example, probably to the right, and the anchor point would be more firm in the right side, where it's saying that if you accept it, more on the right. If you reject it, more on the left, where it is right now. So that's kind of how the anchor point works for that particular situation. So depending on how, so if you were non-committal towards this and you didn't really have an opinion one way or the other on air safety, you would probably fall right here in the middle, where you kind of see both sides of the issue. Also, with chapter 14, social judgment theory, understand how ego involvement plays a role in how we determine our stance. And as we mentioned in the book, ego involvement is this importance or centrality of an issue to a person's life, often demonstrated by membership in a group with a known stand. So, for example, if you are part of a certain political party and you have a firm belief in certain things within that political party, then you are going to have a higher ego involvement towards that particular political party or the things that they believe in. You're not going to be able to be as non-committal because you are part of maybe a group, something that they stand for, whether it's Republican or Democrat or whatever the case is. It's harder for you to be non-committal based on your ego involvement because you have maybe a vested interest in that particular issue and the importance of it. So, as it mentions in the book, if you demonstrate a high ego involvement, you're more likely to be on the far edge of the continuum. Okay. So again, like the continuum listed here, if you have this firm belief based on your ego involvement that you may be based on a past experience that flying is just unsafe, you're going to have a more difficult time being non-committal because of your past experience. So in that particular situation, you're going to be more on the far edge of the continuum, on the far left or the far right, whether you think it's dangerous or you think it's safe. Okay. So for example, if you had a bad experience with flying, maybe there was a near crash or something like that, even though everything was okay, you're going to have that negative perception. It's going to be very hard for you to fall somewhere here in the middle. You're going to be probably more towards this far left continuum that it's dangerous. Or if you've never had a bad experience, you're going to probably fall more on the safety side, on the far right side of this continuum. But the main thing to keep in mind here, the higher the ego involvement that you have, the less likely it is for you to be able to fall into this latitude of non-commitment because you do have those past experiences that are shaping that, and it's hard for you to be unbiased in that regard. Also, with social judgment theory, know the difference between contrast and assimilation, these errors that occur when we're judging a message. And it's important to know there'll be 3 or 4 questions on the test that kind of mention these, and you have to pick out what type of error that is. So contrast is this perceptual error whereby people judge messages that fall within their latitude of rejection as farther from their anchor point than they really are. So if you view something that you reject as even further from what you kind of reject it as. So for example, if you are part of a certain political party and you disagree on a certain issue from someone that's in a different political party, even though the issue that you disagree on might be one thing, you might kind of fall into this error of judging a message called contrast, where you think, well, if we can't agree on this one issue, we probably don't agree on any issues. Where in all reality, you might agree on a majority of the issues. It's just that one issue that you don't agree on. But contrast is kind of this error a lot of times that we have, where we judge messages that fall within our latitude of rejection as even farther away than maybe they really are. So we might say, well, you're a Republican and I'm a Democrat, and we disagree on everything because we're a part of 2 different political parties. Whereas, in fact, they might actually agree on a lot of things, but they're looking at it more from a contrast perspective where everything seems to be a lot more worse than maybe it is. And then you also have this other perception error in judging a message known as assimilation, where you perceive it's kind of a perceptual error whereby people judge messages that fall within their latitude of acceptance as farther from their anchor. So it might be the opposite effect here with the political party example. If you know someone is the same political party as you might actually have a few things that you disagree on, but you might find out that they are a Republican, and you might just assume they agree with everything that you say. They're going to accept everything that you say, and that might not be the case either. So we have these errors. Sometimes we judge things too harshly and think people are total opposites from us when they might not be, and sometimes we assume that people are the same as us until sometimes we find out different. So just remember that contrast is kind of this latitude of rejection. We judge it further away from our anchor point. Assimilation is the latitude of acceptance, and we judge it kind of the same way, only we tend to accept things on a more readily than we would with the contrast perceptual error. Also be familiar with the critique, and this will be the same for chapter 16 as well. It's always good to have a good idea of what other people are saying about these theories. But for this one, application of social judgment, one of the advantages and positive things about it is it does have practical utility. The book mentions the trick is figuring out latitudes of acceptance, non-commitment, and rejection, actually determining how you feel about something. That can be the most challenging part, whether you accept, reject, or you're just non-committal. And while it has not been widely tested empirically, research does support it and validates its claims while proving the theory, although they do prove that it can be falsifiable, again, depending on the context and the background of the situations that occur within this theory. You can't say it's true for every single case, because that's impossible to do. So it can be falsifiable, but understanding the trick of figuring out these latitudes is really important in this particular theory. So that's chapter 14. Again, understanding these ego involvement, how it affects the latitude of acceptance, rejection, and non-committal is one of the important things to understand with chapter 14. All right, chapter 16, we just covered this one on Wednesday, and this one sounds a little bit difficult to try to figure out what it means, but once we kind of went through it on Wednesday, hopefully it was a little bit easier to understand. But basically what cognitive dissonance is, we talked about how cognitive is kind of this perception that we have. And by the way, chapter 14 and 16 both are influence theories, so they both kind of deal with influence and persuasion and things like that. So they're related in that way. But basically what cognitive dissonance theory is this distressing mental state caused by inconsistency between a person's two beliefs of an action. Okay, so we talked about a lot of examples in class about what causes cognitive dissonance and what things shape that. But basically it's when we know something maybe is wrong, but maybe we're doing it anyway. And we use the example of smoking, drinking alcohol. And the book uses smoking as the example they use throughout chapter 16, because back in the years ago, when smoking wasn't necessarily viewed as something that was bad for your health until these studies came out that showed this is really bad for your health, people were forced to kind of grapple with the notion that this is bad for my health, but I'm doing it. So they have this dissonance every time they smoked a cigarette, that they knew it was bad for their health, but they were doing it. So they had this cognitive dissonance. We talked about a lot of examples in class about what types of things can cause dissonance. Could be doing things that you enjoy, even though you know you have something else that you have to be at. We talked about how if you know you need to study for a test, but you go to an intramural basketball game instead, the whole time you're at the intramural basketball game, you might feel a little bit of dissonance because you know that you really need to be back at your dorm studying for the test. And that can even be something that causes dissonance. And that's a result of sometimes doing things that are enjoyable to us, even though we know there's something else more pressing that needs to be done. So it's this distressing mental state that's caused by inconsistency. And we'll talk about a few things within that as well. So basically with the cognitive dissonance theory, you have this attitude or behavior inconsistency. So for example, the smoking example, the behavior that you're demonstrating is that you smoke, okay? And you know that it's bad for your health, so you have this inconsistency that I know it's wrong, but I'm still doing it. So what happens is here on B, you have dissonance that's created because of this attitude or behavior inconsistency. So what a lot of times people do is they just change their attitude completely, and instead of saying, well, I know smoking is bad for my health, but I don't think it's really that bad at all. So they change their attitude on whether they feel that that's wrong at all, which in turn reduces dissonance. They don't have as much dissonance because they change their attitude completely on whether they think that is wrong or not. So that's one way that people reduce dissonance, is just try to change their attitude. And you maybe have seen things happen before where someone maybe knows that something is wrong, but they convince themselves that it's not wrong so that they don't have this dissonance. And the book talks about how reducing dissonance and this confusion in our head is a high a need as satisfying our hunger. Okay, so it's a big need that we have to not have this dissonance because it causes us a lot of stress. and we try our best to not have this dissonance if at all possible. And so a lot of times what they do is here on C, people just change their attitude towards it so it reduces that dissonance. So know the following key terms regarding the cognitive dissonance theory. These are 4 things that people do to maybe avoid having this dissonance as part of the cognitive dissonance theory. The first one is selective exposure. Okay, so tendency people have to avoid information that would create cognitive dissonance because it's incompatible with their current beliefs. And we use the example here of church going. So if you grew up in a certain church and you feel comfortable at that particular church, when you come to Freed Hardeman, there might be some churches that do things more similar to what you're used to. And then there might be other churches that maybe do things that make you feel uncomfortable. So what we discussed with selective exposure is if you don't want to have that dissonance of doing something that maybe you think is wrong, you're probably just going to avoid that particular church or situation that makes you uncomfortable. So you're going to have this selective exposure. You're not going to expose yourself to that environment because it causes you to have dissonance. We talked about how if someone was a recovering alcoholic, then going to a bar or somewhere where they're serving alcohol is going to cause them to have a lot of dissonance because they know they don't need to engage in drinking alcohol, but being in that environment could cause them to want to do that. So what they do is they don't expose themselves to that environment, selectively choose what type of exposure they have or no exposure at all. So that's one way that we avoid dissonance that this theory talks about. The second one with the cognitive dissonance theory is you have this post-decision dissonance or strong doubts experienced after making an important close call decision that is difficult to reverse. For the post-decision dissonance, we talked about these big decisions that you make, and a lot of you maybe haven't experienced this firsthand, but the example would be if you buy a new car or if you buy a new house and you have a big mortgage payment. A lot of times people, after they do that, they kind of have these doubts like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have bought this car or this house because I owe a lot of money on it. And you have this dissonance or this guilt that's associated with making this big purchase or making this big decision. Maybe it's where you're going to go to college. You decide to go to one school, and then after you make that decision, you're like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have chose that school. Maybe I should have picked this school instead. So we all have these doubts with these decisions that we make. But what we do is, because we have this post-decision dissonance, we try to justify it in any way that we can. If you buy a car and you have these kind of doubts about maybe I shouldn't have spent that much money, you might say something like, well, we need a good, reliable vehicle. It's safer for our family if we have a good, reliable vehicle. And you're going to make these justifications for why you made that decision. And that helps reduce the dissonance associated with that particular decision that you made. You might, if it's for college, you might have some dissonance about picking one college over the other, and you might justify that by saying, well, they have a better program in this area that is more what I want to do as a career, so I can justify paying more money to go here because they have more of the program and the career that I want to pursue in the future. So we do these things to help reduce that the dissonance that's created a lot of times post decision process. Third one is minimal justification. The claim that the best way to stimulate an attitude change in others is offer just enough incentive to elicit counter-attitudinal behavior. So we talked about this in some of the other theories as well. If you're trying to persuade somebody, I think this was within the social judgment theory actually, where if you're trying to persuade somebody, you're not going to start with something they automatically reject. You're probably going to start more with something that they're non-committal towards, okay? And that's the same idea with minimal justification. Sometimes in order to, this claim that the best way to stimulate an attitude change in others is just offer enough incentive, it's kind of starting with something small, not just going to something really big. You start small to try to change that attitude, whatever it is that you're talking about. So this minimal justification. We'll talk at the end here about the $20 experiment conducted by Festinger that kind of talks about this minimal justification as well. And then the fourth one is counter-attitudinal advocacy, publicly urging others to believe or do something that is opposed to what the advocate actually believes. In class, we talked about the example of a vegetarian that eats at Chick-fil-A. Okay, so they're urging other people to do something that's opposed maybe to what the way they're actually believing or practicing. We also used the Marlboro Man, the cigarette commercial, and the spokesperson and person that marketed for Marlboro. How he had this dissonance because he did not believe in the products that he was advocating for, but they paid him money to keep silent that he was opposed to their company, and it caused him to have this dissonance that was created as a result of that. So counter-attitudinal advocacy, it's kind of the opposite. We're advocating for something that we do not agree with, and that can cause us to have that dissonance because we're not practicing what we preach in that way. So the $20 experiment, you can find this one in my textbook. It's on pages 198 to 203. It might be a little bit different. It's towards the end of chapter 16. So if you have a newer edition of the textbook, you might find it on a few other pages. But look for the $20 experiment conducted by Festinger in your textbook. And basically, this discusses the minimal justification. So if you read through there, it talks about how this Festinger and social psychologist James Carlsmith recruited Stanford University men to participate in a psychological study, supposedly investigating industrial relations. As each man arrived at the lab, he was assigned the boring and repetitive task of sorting a large batch of spools into sets of 12, turning square pegs a half inch, which was a very tiring and monotonous process. The procedure was designed to be both monotonous and tiring. At the end of an hour of doing these things, moving these square pegs a half inch to the left and sorting these spools into sets of 12, the experimenter approached the subject and made a request. He claimed that a student assistant had failed to show up and that he needed someone to fill in. The experimenter wanted the subject to tell a potential female subject in the waiting room how much fun the experiment was. Dissonance researchers call this counter-attitudinal advocacy, where most people would probably call that just telling a lie, telling somebody it's fun when it really wasn't fun. So basically what they did was they offered some of the men that were participating in this experiment $20, and some of them they only offered $1. And what happened was the ones that were offered $20, it interpreted the results. Festinger interpreted these results, noted that $20 was a huge sum of money at the time. If a student felt qualms about telling a white lie, the cash was a justification for doing that. So if it was a $20 that they were getting, they justified it by saying the money was worth telling that white lie. But the dollar one was the interesting example. Festinger said that $1 was just barely enough to induce compliance to the experimenter's request, enough to get them to lie, but not enough to justify it. So the students had to create another justification. They changed their attitude toward the task to bring it into line with their behavior. In other words, to eliminate dissonance. So those that accepted the $1 to tell the white lie changed their attitude towards it and convinced themselves it actually was fun to sort those spools into sets of 12 and to turn those pegs a quarter inch to the right. So basically, we create this attitude change. And those that did it for $20 didn't have as much qualms about doing it, but those that did it for $1 actually changed their attitude and convinced themselves that it was fun, so they didn't have the dissonance created by telling this person that it was fun when it really, in fact, was not. Okay, so that one's a little bit confusing, so I encourage you to kind of look over that experiment because it helps not only describe this minimal justification with giving someone just $1, but it also talks about this counter-attitudinal advocacy where they're urging someone to do something and telling them that it's fun when it really wasn't a fun thing. But this incentive that they got to do that caused the people with $1 to change their attitude completely. The ones with $20, it didn't really make much difference because they justified it by getting money to do that. So that's a very interesting experiment. We didn't review that a whole lot in class, so I wanted to make sure you were familiar with that. There will be a question on the test that talks about that, so I want to make sure you were aware what that means. But the main point of the experiment was to demonstrate that people alter their attitudes towards a task to justify their behavior. Okay, so again, chapters 14 and 16 will be the main focus for the test on Wednesday.